If you want to go ahead and turn to 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, where we'll get our lesson from this morning. This is our main text. You know, the idea of one of the sermon topics that's going to run throughout the course of the year are people who would change the church. This isn't necessarily that, but this is certainly in keeping with the idea about those who would change the church, those who would leave the church, those who would forsake the church. They're all the same, folks. If somebody's going to change the church, they've forsaken the church. They've forsaken God. If they're going to make a fundamental change to what the church is and how it was established, how it was delivered to us, then they've changed the church. They've forsaken it. So let's talk about that just a little bit this morning. I have to admit, when I ended up getting on Facebook strictly by accident. I wasn't looking out for that. I really wasn't. It wasn't really something that I was interested in. Now, I've enjoyed it for the most part. I've enjoyed catching up with folks that I had lost track of, finding out new things, making new friends I was not expecting to make. But I never thought I would get much out of Facebook. It seemed like it was kind of silly, this new social media, and I really didn't think it was going to go anywhere. Well, you know, like I said, I'm technologically challenged, and I had no idea that it was going to be as big as it is. The idea of instantaneously being able to communicate with people other than picking up a phone, just didn't think it was going to go anywhere. I thought it was kind of silly. But of course, I was somewhat wrong. It has been good. It's been beneficial. Keeping up with friends that maybe I would have spoken with. Of course, guys are a little bit different, right? We call somebody, we talk to them for about 10 minutes. That's good for the year. I'll call you back next year. We'll talk again. That's good. We just don't, this friendships are not quite the same. But I'm able to keep up with friends that I might have spoken to once a year. I keep births, deaths, birthdays, all of those things, anniversaries. The idea that I can mourn with those who mourn and I can rejoice with those who are rejoicing, yes. But there are a few drawbacks, and those drawbacks are not quite what I thought they would be. In keeping up with people who are members of the Lord's church, maybe people that I went to college with at Freed-Hardeman, people that I was in the same social club with, I sat in class with, I sat next to in chapel every morning, Bible class, all of those things, people that I knew who they were, I knew who their families were, I knew what they believed, at least I thought I did. They were faithful members of the Lord's body. And in keeping up with them and keeping in contact with them, I look down and where it says, you know, church or faith or whatever, some of them put nothing. Some of them say, I attend XYZ denominational church somewhere else. And these faithful Christians now confess a different faith than they confessed when I knew them that many years ago. I believe them to be faithful Christians, and now they attend community churches that use, say, instrumental music, or women who are pulpit ministers. You know, truthfully, the idea of social media, I don't know if I would rather know about these things or be blissfully ignorant. You know, in some ways, it's good to know. In some ways, it saddens you to know that people have strayed that far from the truth. It is a difficult thing. Some of this has popped up. I didn't know about it. I didn't watch it happen. It popped up, you know, in their storyline or newsline or lifeline or whatever they call it on there. I found out about it after the fact. But I dare say that many people here have seen people in the process of falling away from the Lord's church. You've seen it happen. You've seen someone hear something, become involved with someone who is not a Christian, take a job that pulls them away from the church, go to a school that pulls them away from the church, get involved in an activity that pulls them away from the church. Maybe something's happened in their life. They've lost someone, they've lost a job, they've become sick, and they become disillusioned, they become angry with God, and they fall away from the church. I bet you everyone in here has a story, and every one of them is equally sad to see someone who was a once faithful member of the Lord's body no longer be a faithful member of the Lord's body. It's especially sad, I think, when it happens over time and you see someone slip away and effort after effort is made to throw them that lifeline, to throw them that life preserver and pull them back into the boat. And rather than reach out and grab it, they start paddling backwards, paddling away from the boat. And you realize this is someone who doesn't want to be reached. They don't want to become faithful again. They don't want to be part of the Lord's body again. It's a difficult thing. It truly is a difficult thing to watch someone depart from the faith. What does Paul say to Timothy? 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. You know, the early church, it must have been a marvelous thing to be a part of the early church. Can you imagine what that was like? I think about that sometimes. I read the accounts of the early church in the book of Acts, and then I read these letters that Paul was writing to these young churches, and the letters that Peter and John and all of these men were writing to the early church, and I think how exciting it must have been to be a part of the early church, in spite of all of the problems and all of the stumbling blocks that Satan was casting in front of them. In spite of all of these things, it must have been incredibly exciting to be a part of that early church. To watch it come out of this small Genesis in Jerusalem on that day of Pentecost, and watch it spread. And by all accounts, it spread like wildfire. It was exponential. You know, it's like that old commercial, and I told two friends, and they told two friends, and so on and so on. And you see the split screen, and you see all these faces fill the screen. That's what it was like with the early church. It started with 3,000, and then it quickly spread, and it went all over the world. And these people were converting entire villages. Synagogues were being converted because they heard the good news of the Messiah that had come and had put his life on the line and had been sacrificed and had been resurrected and had gone to ascend to heaven. And these people are reading about, this is the Messiah? This is the one that Isaiah was prophesying about? Yes. This is the one Ezekiel was talking about? Yes. And how exciting that must have been. But then to realize that the progression of good news was not going to come without its pitfalls. It's not going to come without its setbacks. And here's Paul writing to Timothy, and he says, now the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, that Spirit that was to guide them into all truth and to give them utterance, says, now the Spirit expressly said that in later times, some will depart from the faith. Some will depart from the faith. And you imagine Timothy, this young preacher, getting this letter. He starts reading this letter from Paul, this man he sees as his spiritual father. This is a father figure to him. He's reading this, and he's always been filled with good news and joy and all of these things. And here, it's like a raining on the parade, much like we feel when we see somebody falling away and swimming out further away from the boat. Here he says, the Spirit says that there are some that are going to fall away. They're going to depart from the faith. But look at what he says they're going to do. This is not simply a matter of, this isn't for me. I just don't feel comfortable with this. I want to go back to what feels familiar. That's not what's happening. It says there are going to be some who will depart from the faith by devoting themselves now. As we're told to devote ourselves to our faith, as we're told to devote ourselves to Christ, as we're told to devote ourselves to God, and by doing that we engage in all of the practices that keep us faithful, one of which we're engaging in today. Folks, worship keeps us faithful. When we are faithful in our worship, we can be faithful in all things. This is what builds us up. This is what we come here to do. This is what we devote ourselves to. What else do we devote ourselves? We devote ourselves to prayer. We devote ourselves to study. We devote ourselves to evangelism. We devote ourselves to all of those things. But here he says, it's difficult for Timothy to hear, but he must hear these things. He cannot be caught unawares. So he tells them there are going to be those who will fall away. They will depart from the faith by devoting themselves, giving themselves over to deceitful spirits and the teachings of demons. Through the insincerity of liars whose consciences are seared, who forbid marriage and require abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. Now you could take your own guesses as to who Paul was referring to, or he was alluding to in that warning about the abstinence of marriage and the abstinence of food. You can draw your own conclusions from that. But this idea, here's Timothy, this preacher that's devoted himself to preaching the word of the Lord. He's devoted himself to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And what Paul has instructed him to do And now he has been, I can imagine reading this, it feels like his guts have been ripped out to realize that there were going to be people, not just people who were falling away, but people who were going to devote themselves to false doctrines. And in doing so, they were going to pull other people away from the Lord's body. They were going to draw people to them. To hear this must have just been gut-wrenching. You know, it's much like people who become New Testament Christians, right? They become New Testament Christians, and they're so excited. They're so happy. They're so filled with the joy of becoming a New Testament Christian and all of the benefits and the blessings and the freedoms that brings. And they realize, oftentimes to their dismay, that the church is made up of people. The church is made up of people with all of their faults, all of their foibles, all of their weaknesses, and all of those things. And for a new Christian to realize that, yes, sister such and such has a problem with gossip, brother such and such has a problem with his temper. Don't get on his bad side. And we sometimes have to warn these new Christians about the pitfalls of the very people that they are to look to as a lifeline, and here it is. Like these young guys who, I want to get elected to public office, and I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to go to Washington and make a difference. Then they get up there and realize what they're up against. They realize they don't want to change anything. Hey, we got a good thing going, don't we? You know, we do this for a little while, and we make some good money, and we could stay in here forever. We don't have to deal with the problems that the people that we're supposed to represent are dealing with. We got it made, folks. And for these young guys and young ladies that get up there and say, I'm excited. I want to do the right thing. I want to make, and they realize now. And then what happens? You see them, and the last thing you see is their head and their hand going under, waving bye-bye, because they've got sucked down into that swamp. There it is. It happened. Here's Timothy reading this letter, and he realizes it's not always going to be this beautiful, growing, blossoming organism that just keeps bringing people in, and they keep hearing the word. No, it's not going to be like that forever. There are going to be those who are going to fall away. So Paul basically is giving Timothy a heads up. So here's the question then. We know this is going to happen. It was foretold at the very beginning that this was going to occur. The church was not going to remain perfect and intact and with no issues and no problems. It was going to happen. So what's going to happen? Well, one thing, Paul tells Timothy to do something. In chapter 4, verses 13 and 14, he tells them, until I come then, devote yourself. You know, as those who were devoting themselves to false doctrine and the teachings of demons. He says, until I come, devote yourself to the public reading of Scripture, to exhortation, to teaching. Do not neglect the gift that you have, which was given to you by prophecy when the council of the elders laid their hands on you. So this thing is going to happen. So this is what I want you to do. I want you to, as these people have devoted themselves to these falsehoods, I want you to devote yourselves to the truth. That idea of devotion is an important one, folks. We need to remember what devoting means. It means that we do not give up, we do not give in, we do not let anything sway us from that. If the opportunity presents itself, rather than reading books written by men, we read the book that was inspired by God Almighty. We read the Word of the Lord. Read it publicly. I believe that we do that here. We read Scripture. We don't come in and listen to feel good and how to be a better person. We want to know how to be a better Christian. We want to know how to be a better servant. That's what we want. Not simply so that we can feel good about ourselves when we leave. We realize when a change needs to be made, when we need to do better in our actions towards God. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 6. If you want to turn to Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 6. And what is our responsibility as individuals and as the church body? You know, we have two. They're not dissimilar, but they're separate. We have an individual responsibility to those in error, and we have a church responsibility to those in error. First, we have to make sure that there is a sense of love on our part towards the erring member of the body. Essential. Even those folks who are teaching that 70 AD doctrine that I talked about a couple of weeks ago. we still have a responsibility to show love to them. We are concerned for their soul because their soul is in danger. It's in danger of being lost. Christ had reclaimed it from Satan, and they're ready to hand it back over again. But in Hebrews 12, verse 6 says, "For the Lord disciplines the one He loves and chastises every son whom He receives." So not only are we to love, we are to reprove and rebuke and to chastise and to discipline. Why? Because we love them. We don't want them to be handed over to Satan. We don't want them to have their part in that lake of fire. We want them to be saved. In Proverbs 3, verse 12, it says, "For the Lord reproves him whom He loves, as a father the son in whom He delights." Well, what does this do? Well, it gives the person in error the knowledge that not only is there a loving God, but there is a family that wants him to come home. You know, we talked about the prodigal son last 2 Sundays in our afternoon class. We saw 2 things. We saw a father that wanted his son to come home. He ran to meet him. Then we saw a secondary part of that family. We saw the older brother. The older brother wasn't quite as happy to see him return. He still had a very human grudge against this younger son who had gone off into this far country and hurt his parents deeply, taken that part of his inheritance and had gone away. But what we do is we look at the example of the father. The father said he saw him, and not only did he see him, he picked up the idea of he gathered up his robes and he ran, which would have been unheard of for an older man to go running, especially to the one that had hurt him. It would have been the responsibility of the son to come back and to beg forgiveness. The father picked up his robes and ran to the son. What a sight that must have been. People saying, how undignified. Does he have no sense of pride? Does he have no shame in himself? No. He says, I love my son. I am running to meet him. We need to take an example of the father, not the son, not the older son. Consider that admonition from Paul to Galatia. Chapter 6, verse 1 of the book of Galatians, it says, "Brothers, if anyone is caught in transgression, you who are spiritual," which should be all of us, folks, we all should be spiritual. We are both religious and spiritual, unlike the world who thinks you can be spiritual but not religious. We're both. We're religious, we do the things, and we're spiritual because we have a spirit about it. "Brothers, if anybody is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourselves, lest you too should be tempted." So now we know what the responsibility is. So let's look at this. Let's look at 4 points, and then the lesson is yours. 4 points. Anyone can be caught in transgression, folks. Do not be fooled. Do not believe that because of my advanced age and because of my advanced knowledge. Folks, I know brothers who have been gospel preachers for a number of years who are caught up in transgression. Public transgression. Not some secret sin that no one knows about. Public transgression. Anyone can be caught up. I've seen elders, deacons, preachers, preachers' wives, deacons' wives, elders' wives. Everybody in the congregation can be caught up in a transgression, and to say it cannot happen to me, you are fooling yourself. It can happen to you. Because we all can lose sight of Jesus Christ. Especially when we don't keep Him and devote ourselves to the Word. We certainly can lose track. We certainly can lose sight. And when we do, folks, we will find ourselves in transgression. To say, as a point of pride, it can't happen to me. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13, it tells us, "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man." That word common is there for a reason. It happens. It happens on a regular basis. We like to look at some sin and say, that's absolutely absurd. That could never happen in the church. Look at the church that he was writing to. This is the same church that had a sin that was going on that was absolutely unheard of even in the Gentile world. Not only was it happening, the church was almost glorying in it. It was almost a point of pride. So to say that it cannot happen, we're fooling ourselves. We're deluding ourselves. It says, God is faithful, though, and He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, He also will provide a way of escape that you may be able to endure it. Number 2, we have to restore the one in error. Now we cannot understand that idea of restore. Restoration cannot happen while the sin is ongoing. A lot of people believe that. And I've seen a lot of congregations. There's been no attempt made to ensure that sin is no longer ongoing. and they restore that person. They'll bring them forward, and they will listen to that confession. They will allow that person to confess, and they ask for forgiveness, and forgiveness is given. And it's almost like, well, we just don't want to know any more than that. If we know something else, we might be offended, we might be hurt, we might be surprised. Folks, we have to make sure that sin is not ongoing. That falls to us to do. If we can't allow the church to be polluted, we can't allow the church to be filled with leaven, we have to purge out that leaven. We have to make sure that that sin is not ongoing. But if that sin, and when that sin is forgiven of and repented of, and is no longer being engaged in, we restore that one. Restore them fully, as that father did to that prodigal son who came back. He didn't bring him back as a hired servant, which is what the son wanted. He said, I'm not even worthy to be called your son. Just make me a servant. At least I'll have food. At least I'll have shoes on my feet. He said, no. When I restore you, you're my son again. You're my son. You were always my son. You were my son when you were gone. Now you're going to have all of the accoutrements that go with my son. You're going to have shoes on your feet. You're going to have a ring on your finger. You're going to have a robe on your back. You are my son. Folks, if that's the way the father brought back the son, that's the way we need to bring back a prodigal. That's the way we need to bring back that errant one who has repented, truly repented, and asked for forgiveness. We restore them wholly and fully. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5. We need to remember this. In order to restore such a one in error, we must be spiritual in nature, not physical. If we simply look at the physical, we can't forgive and we can't restore in the way that we need to restore. Why? Because if we look at things as in our temporal form, if we look at things exclusively physically, we cannot restore, because we're always going to seek to do harm when harm was done. As a spiritual person, we seek good when harm was done. When a brother offends me, if I look at things strictly from a physical standpoint, I want to repay evil for evil, not good for evil. So if I'm going to truly restore one who has injured me, if I'm going to restore one who has sinned against me, who has trespassed against me, I must be spiritual in nature, not physical. 1 Peter 2 verse 5, it says, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. We must be spiritual in nature. Because if we're not, we can't restore. We can't restore such a one. It must be a spiritual house. And lastly, we have to restore that erring member in a sense of gentleness. We have to appeal to them. We condemn behavior. We do not condemn individuals. It's not for us to do. But we are told to render righteous judgment. If we see action and it is improper and immoral and sinful, we must, of necessity, render a righteous judgment. That behavior is wrong, but we have no right to condemn the individual. What do? Jesus oftentimes, he didn't use the word sinner very often. He used the word lost. And I've mentioned this several times, especially on our Sunday afternoon class. Jesus used the word lost more than he used the word sinner. There's a reason for that. Yes, as a sinner, you are lost. But the idea of lost is the sense that we need to understand in regards to those people. They're lost. They're wandering around. They're blind. They're staggering around trying to find light. This is what's going on. This is what's happening with them. They're lost. They're lost. They're without Christ. They're seeking about. You think about the idea of reaching out and trying to find your way simply by touch, and you misunderstand where you are and you find yourself even further away. This is what's happening. We have to appeal to them. We have to call out to them. If you're trying to get somebody over to you, and they're trying to find their way, what do you keep doing? You keep saying things so they can get a sense of where you are. That's how we reach out to people. We have to tailor our approach oftentimes to individuals. Different tacts for different folks, right? That's the way we work. Some people we could just walk up to and speak pretty bluntly to them. Oftentimes we have to use kid gloves, whatever it takes. It doesn't matter. Whatever it takes to get that person back, that's what we do. That's the method we use, whatever it takes to get them back. It does not mean that we compromise. The Word? Absolutely not. The Word must be adhered to at all times. But whatever else we can do, that's what we do. But regardless of our approach, whatever our approach, we have to make the approach. We have to bring the body back together. We restore. That idea of restoration is an important. We restore them. Restore means so many things in so many different ways. You talk about the idea of you talk about folks that they take old cars and they restore them. Nothing is left uncovered. Everything is touched. A true restoration means they bring it back to the way it was. Not just the best it can be, but the way that it was, and we can do that. God does that, so why can't we? This is our obligation. This is our commandment. It's not an option. It doesn't say, if it doesn't hurt the body too much, or if it doesn't offend your sensibilities, if it doesn't make you feel uncomfortable, restore such a one. He says, restore them. If they're in error, restore them. Do what you need to do, folks. We're told people are going to fall away. We ought to know this. It should come as no surprise. But we also know that if they fall away, they can come back, as that prodigal son did. They can always come back. And when they come back, we should have been, as that father was running out, that's where we need to be. We need to be following the father out to embrace that prodigal son and restore such a one. You may have sin in your life. You need to be restored. No better time than the present. No better time than right now. If you need to be restored to the Lord's body, if you've fallen away, if you've sinned, if you've erred, if you've done something that you're not supposed to do, you know, you need to make it right. Come while we stand and while we sing. Tenderly